You are listening to WTUZ Radio Podcast. Welcome to WTUZ Radio Podcast. I am your host, Rhonda. And tonight's podcast, this shout out to the God of Green. He sent me some information and we were talking back and forth on it, and it intrigued me. He is also the host of the YouTube channel, The Autonomous Party. They air every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And tomorrow night, Sunday, they are having the guest author, Lee Cumming, who is the author of The Negro Question Part 6, The 13 Black Colonies, and The Negro Question Part 4, The Missing Link. And he has several other books as well. So he will be a guest on the Autonomous Party YouTube channel tomorrow. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I will drop a link in the description of this video so you all can check that interview out and subscribe to the channel as well. He is doing some great work over there. So he dropped me some information concerning, was King James the First, King James Stewart, was he really a Catholic? Okay, so those that know the story of King James getting pretty much kicked off the throne, the whole Cromwell situation, driving out the Protestants, etc., etc., and King James being a supporter of Protestants and not wanting the Catholic Church on his back, yada, 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 and wanted England to be able to practice the religion that they wanted to practice and to be from up under the Catholic Church. So that was interesting when the brother sent me the information, because I sat back and thought, very well could be possible, because when we think of religion today, how it's taught, and even back then as well, it is more on a spiritual journey versus for the elite or those that are sitting in those seats of power. Religion is not about spirituality and belief. It's really about political power. Okay. And then I just started to recall some of the events that was happening in history and how the families cross-married. Okay. So meaning enemies, supposedly and allegedly enemies, cross-married. And then I got to thinking about King James himself. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to use a little deductive reasoning here and do the best research that I can and to come up with my own conclusion. So, the title of this podcast is, was King James a Catholic, or was he non-religious? So let's get into some of the information. Let me use a little bit of technology here. All righty. Okay, so this is the information that Brother God of Green sent me. This is a blog called Was King James the First a Closeted Roman Catholic? So this is a review of King James and Papal Opposition by Stephen A. Costin Sr. Okay. So this particular blog is off of Jesus is Lord. So Jesus-is-Lord.com. All right. So let's get into it. It is often asserted that King James was a closet Catholic. Was he? What does the extant historical record say? These are the questions that Stephen Costin answers in his new work, King James and Papal Opposition. True to form, Mr. Costin appeals to valuable primary source documentation in order to educate and convince his readers. At the end of his introduction, Mr. Costin states, as the evidence is clear, speaking for itself, I will begin and end by appealing to the evidence. I am not asking you to consider what I think James might have believed. I am not requesting you consider the opinions of what some scholars think James may have held to. I am asking you to consider what James actually believed, wrote, and did. In short, I appeal to the facts of history. Will you listen? In Papal Opposition, Mr. Costin handedly proves his thesis. Not only was King James not a Roman Catholic, but he actually opposed the errors of Rome. Okay. We'll roll with what you say, although, there's other accounts of him saying he is a Roman, but okay, we'll continue. Mr. Costin's selection and arrangement of the king's prolific writings give us a picture of a bold Christian king who fought to keep a bloody papacy off his back while living in his kingdom. Mr. Costin did not stop at King James' writings. He includes those of high-ranking papists who consider King James a heretic king. Complementing the rich, relevant primary source documentation found in Papal Opposition is Mr. Costin's insightful historical commentary. He does not second-guess King James, but rather helps the reader to put King James' actions and words in context of the political/religious climate of the time. Okay, so now it's good that they included in here politics and religion, because to be honest, it was more about the politics than religion. Okay, so that's good that the author of this particular blog puts that in play. Mr. Costin's appeal to primary source documentation is refreshing in a time when revisionist historians seek to rewrite history based on rumor, speculation, and wishful thinking. Our historians oftentimes plagiarize one another's work, not taking time to go back and do real research. It seems Mr. Costin's was made for such a time as this. His ability to locate, synthesize, and analyze primary source data is probably the most important aspect of his work. The full title of his work is King James and Papal Opposition, or Royal Opposition to Papal Authority during the reign of King James of Scotland. King James, the 6th of Scotland and the 1st of England. Papal Opposition is a short work consisting of 76 pages, but boy, is it power-packed. For those that love the faith which was once delivered to the saints, this work will probably elicit more than a few hearty amens. Papal Opposition is illustrated with the beautiful artwork by Richard Nemir, which transports the reader back to a stylistic 17th century England. Now, I will pull this, and I'm going to review it at a later date and see what Mr. Costin has to say, and if I need to do a follow-up on it, I will. Didn't bring it into play into this because I'm going to use several points of view, and I don't want to make Costin's work the main point of view. So I'm choosing to use this as a summary of his work. The premise: Mr. Coxton gives the overview of papal opposition. This article will be citing three primary categories of works of James to establish my premise, which is that King James was not a Roman Catholic. The first section will be a review of James' personal correspondence. The second section will be devoted to a listing of pertinent royal proclamations of James. The third and final segment will be a review of James' political writing, page 6 of Papal Opposition. This review will not begin to touch on all the writings and compelling points found in Papal Opposition. We'll give some highlights and then trust that the interested reader will read this well-documented work for himself. Was King James a papist? His Majesty King James was not only Protestant, but he actually opposed the Pope and wrote vehemently against the errors of Roman Catholicism. King James knew well the spiritual and temporal danger of Romanism. His English predecessor, Elizabeth I, was staunchly Protestant and also knew well of Catholic intrigues, murders, and plots. Elizabeth's own predecessor and half-sister was known as Bloody Mary. You know what, now that I think about it, is that where that drink come from? All right, stay focused, Rhonda. Bloody Mary was a Catholic queen determined to restore Romanism to England. In the process, she took out 300 faithful Protestants who refused to bow to the knee of the Pope and his henchmen. In the providence of God, Bloody Mary had no children, hence no heir to the throne. What did King James say about the lore of Catholic saints? I am loath to believe all the tales of the legend saints concerning the supposed miracles they perform in response to prayers to them. King James called them but tricks. What did King James say about Catholic relics adoring dead saints' body parts? For relics of saints, if I had any such that I were assured were members of their body, I would honorably bury them and not give them the reward of condemned men's members, which are only ordained to be deprived of burial, but for worshiping either them or images. I must account it's damnable idol worship, idolatry. I quarrel the making of image either for public decoration or for men private uses, but that they should be worshipped, be prayed to, or any holiness attributed unto them was never known of the ancients. And the scriptures are so directly, vehemently, and punctually against it as I wonder what brain of man or suggestion of Satan durst offer it to Christians. But the scripture forbiddeth to worship the image of anything that God created. The image of God is not only expressly forbidden to be worshipped, but even to be made. The reason given that no eye ever saw God, and how can we paint his face? Let them, therefore, that maintain this doctrine answer it to Christ at the latter day, when he shall accuse them of idolatry. But Christ's cross must have a particular privilege, say they, and be worshipped. Nay, rather say he, blessed are those that hear the word of God and keep it. So as we are going through what they say that King James said, I want y'all to remember this, because we're going to go to several different things, several other sources, and then I'm going to give my opinion based on these sources using my particular logic So just remember, I want you all to remember what King James is saying, because, according to this, what we're reading through, he is a Christian, okay? And particularly, he is a Protestant, and he is against the Catholic religion, and they're giving the reasons why he is against it, according to them in his own words. Purgatory. As for purgatory and all the trash depending thereupon, it is not worth the talking of. Bellarmine, Roman cardinal, cannot find any ground for it in all the scriptures. But as for me, I am sure there is a heaven and hell for the elect and reprobate. Heaven and hell are the revealed to the eternal home of all mankind. Let us endure to win the one and eschew the other. The infallibility of the Pope. So I utterly deny that there is an earthly monarch thereof, whose word must be law. And see, in my opinion, I'm going to start out early. I think this was really what the issue was between James and the Catholic Church. This was more on a political power side versus religion. But I'll continue. All right, so I utterly deny that there is an earthly monarch thereof, whose word must be a law, and who cannot err in his sentence by an infallibility, of spirit. Christ did not promise before his ascension to leave Peter with them to direct and instruct them in all things, but he promised to send the Holy Ghost unto them for the end. But how they are now come to Christ's vicars, nay, gods on earth, triple-crowned, King of heaven, earth, and hell, judges of all world, and none to judge them, heads of the faith, absolute deciders of all controversies by the infallibility of their spirit, having all power, both spiritual and temporal, in their hands, the high bishops, monarchs of the whole earth, superiors to all emperors and kings. I'm just going to read that again. Superiors to all emperors and kings, ye supreme vice gods, who rather will or cannot err. How they now come is, say, to top of greatness, I know not, but sure I am, we that are kings have the greatest need to look into. Okay, so now again, this is me, in my opinion, because this is what sparked my interest to do this when I heard about the controversy about him being a closeted Catholic. To me, the whole battle was not a spiritual one. It was, as it always is, wasn't a religious one. This was about his particular rulership as king having limited power, having to answer to the Catholic Church. All right, but we'll continue. As for me, Paul and Peter, I know, but these men I know not. But I am sure none will condemn for an heretic, save such as make the Pope their God, and think him such a speaking scripture as they can define heresy no otherwise. Rome shall be the seat of the Antichrist. Rome is the seat of the Antichrist. Okay. So that's interesting, because we know today folks still reign true to this statement about Rome being the seat of the Antichrist. Okay, so to be honest, most religions outside of Catholicism feel this way about the Catholic Church. Okay. King James labored to prove the Pope to be the Antichrist out of Scripture, and this opinion no Pope can ever make me recant. Having now made this digression against the Antichrist, which I am sure I can better fasten upon the Pope than Bellarmine, remember he was a bishop, the Romanist cardinal, can do in his pretended temporal superiority over kings. Popery is indeed the mystery of inequity. Okay. Praying to Mary. Child, they didn't know. He went down the list, honey. And first for the Blessed Virgin Mary, I yield her that which the angel Gabriel pronounced of her. I reverence her as the mother of Christ, but I dare not mark her in blasphemy God, praying her to command and control her Son, who is her God and her Savior, nor yet not I think that she hath no other thing to do in heaven than to hear every idle man's suit and busy herself in their errands while commanding her Son, while coming down to kiss and make love with priests, and while disputing and brawling with devils. In heaven she is in eternal glory and joy, never to be interrupted with any worldly business, and there I leave her with her blessed Son and our Savior, and in her eternal felicity. So in other words, what are y'all doing sitting up on y'all behind, worshiping Mary, putting her on a pedestal that she shouldn't be on? Yeah, okay, yeah, I know that she birthed the Lord. I know all of that, but I'm just saying, y'all shouldn't be idol worshiping her. Okay, so that's interesting. So let's get on the next grievance of King James with the Catholic Church. Forced celibacy of priests. What he had to say on this? By their fornication is meant both their spiritual fornication of idolatry and also their corporal fornication, which thou the more abound amongst them, as well by reason of their restraint of their churchmen from marriage, as also because of the many orders of idle monastic lives among them, as well for men as women, and continual experiences prove that idleness is ever the greatest spur to lechery. Okay. All right. So he wasn't with that celibacy of priests, which from my understanding, just reading various older texts, it wasn't always so that priests were celibate, because a lot of them had children and all of that jazz. So I don't know when that it got really, really strict, where they had to be celibate. But that's interesting that he was like, nah, I'm not with that. All right, so let's continue. Sacrament of confessions to priests. How damnable this doctrine is. So he didn't have no more to say on that. Okay, it says, so the Romanist response to King James comments. King James is no Catholic, neither is he a Christian. Well, I'm going to get into that a little more, but let's continue. King James responded by saying he was saved without the aid of Rome and a Catholic. In the true historic sense of the word, Mr. Costans explained that the word Catholic refers to the universal body of believers, not the Romanist perversion. Catholic inquisitioners and Cardinal Bellarmine, the Pope's champion, called King James a heretic king. King James said that since he was never a Catholic, he could not be termed a heretic. Child, they was really going at it. Okay, because back then, when these folks were seated in the spot on the throne, the particular church, specifically the Catholic Church, always had someone from the church assigned to them. So I'm going to assume it was at the level of a cardinal. All right. Okay. And what I don't like that's still not brought to the forefront of just how much power these particular churches had on these monarchs. Okay. And that's why you would hear stories periodically of these kings going up against the church. Okay. Because Henry VIII was another one, because he wanted to sit up and get his swerve on a regular basis, getting divorced. He was a serial married, always trying to get married on a regular basis. And the Catholic Church don't believe in divorce. Okay, so that was just one example. But the point I'm trying to make is what is really still not talked about in history is just how powerful the Catholic Church was in these seats of power. And if you go behind the scenes and get the hidden history, and shout out to Brother Odell from the UK, we want to get real honest about it. The Catholic Church was seating these different monarchs. Okay? They really made the decisions who sat on the different thrones around the world that they essentially colonized. They gave those particular monarchs the blueprint on how they were going to colonize, and part of that colonization blueprint was to make everyone around the world Christians. Okay. So if we really want to get truthful about it, all religions really roll up to the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church authorized and sanctioned those religions. So as they were going around the world, colonizing and sending their missionaries were under various other faiths also. And they were authorized to put people under Christianity. And I have to be careful how I say this for censorship, but even the religion that starts with a J, ends with an S, it ultimately rolls up to the Catholic Church. Okay. All right. So that is the real hidden information. Okay. So even though we are going through this, I'm doing this for a couple of folks to just, number one, bring to the forefront of folks that were not familiar with the rumor that King James was really a Catholic. But I also want to bring to folks' attention that this really wasn't about religion. This was more about how much power a king really had. Okay? All right. But we're going to continue because I want to get through this source, go through a couple of more sources, and then give my humble opinion. All right. So here we go. But wasn't King James baptized as a Catholic? Child, let me sip my water. King James' mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a well-known Papist. Yup. The king never knew his mother. She was arrested when he was 1 year old and spent 19 years in prison in England under Elizabeth I, where she was finally executed for treason. Because Mary had King James baptized under Romanist rites, Cardinal Bellarmine said, "In our supernatural birth and baptism, we are to conceive of a secret and implied oath." Now, child, clutching pearls. Child, I'm going to clutch my pearls. When we tell you all about baptism, we told you all you are aligning yourself spiritually. That is a spiritual contract. We told you that. We're consistent with that. So here go Cardinal Bellarmine saying, in our supernatural birth in baptism, we are to conceive of a secret and implied oath, which we take at our new birth, to yield obedience to a spiritual prince, which is Christ's vicar. Now I'm going to pause right there for those who really don't understand what baptism is. Okay? And that does not matter which faith you are getting baptized towards. Okay? And as we discussed this last Thursday, a couple days ago, this is Saturday, right? Yeah, a couple days ago, that, the baptism seals that ritual. It seals the oath. It seals the contract. So, oh boy, Cardinal busted him out. Like, okay, you want to sit up here and talk about you're not Catholic, but you were baptized as a Catholic. Child, let's see what King James had to say. It is to be wondered at whence this fellow had this strange new divinity, which surely was first framed in his own fantastic brain. Else let him make us catalog of his authors that hold and teach that all Christians, whether infants or of age, are by virtue of an oath taken in their baptism, bound to yield absolute obedience to Christ's vicar, the Pope, or baptized in any but in Christ. Child, gentle reader, this is but a small sampling of the quotes you will find in King James and papal opposition, but it should be more than enough for any objective person to see King James was no papist. So if I'm reading this correct, what King James is trying to say, well, listen, I was an infant, I wasn't of age, so how did I have a choice in that matter? Child, we talk about that all the time with these oaths that are being put upon these innocent children getting christened or baptized or getting certificates put upon them. Okay, talking in code, y'all should know what I mean. So King James was like, what that got to do with me? I was an infant. So let's see. In spite of this overwhelming evidence, detractors of King James, in a last-ditch effort, appealed to King James' statement, "I acknowledge the Roman Church to be our mother church." In papal opposition, Mr. Costin put this phrase back in the context in which it was spoken, and then goes on to define the term mother church. Essentially, the Church of England, of which King James was head, came forth from the Church of Rome during the reign of King Henry VIII. Okay, remember, King Henry, that wanted to keep getting his swerve on a regular basis through marriage. He went up against the church because he was trying to get a divorce. And they told him, no, go on and sit down with it. He came up with every excuse in the book for that divorce. And the church was pretty much like, nah, bruh, that's not good enough. So he's like, okay, I got something for y'all. You want to play with me? I'll just form my own church. Okay. All right. So now I can't speak on King Henry if he was doing it for power or to get his swerve on. To me, it was really both. But the bottom line, as I stated before, the Catholic Church had a lot of power on what went on these with these kings. Okay? Now, if you understand the spiritual connotation with folks being baptized, aka performing a ritual and going into a spiritual contract, which ties your spiritual soul to hence that particular system, would it not make sense if you were a king that not only do you not want to be physically ruled under this particular entity called, the Catholic Church, but spiritually, you want that power as well. So you want the physical power and you want the spiritual power of having spiritual contracts or spiritual souls tied to your particular entity called the Church of Rome, okay, which became, they said, the Church of England. Okay, but by default, folks do have a point. If King James, King Henry them was saying that the Church of England is from the Church of Rome, and if the Catholic Church is the Church of Rome, then ain't that really still Catholic? But okay, let's just continue. Most of us familiar with the womanizing Henry's spurn request for a divorce, honey, he was a hot mess, knocking off his wives and everything, child. And what woman would continue to line up to get married to him after he done not just divorce, forget divorce, literally that he had his wife knocked off? Who would line up to remarry that fool? No, blood, I'm good on that. Trust me, I'm good. We can be cool, whatever the case may be. I'm good. But anyway, as a result, he broke with Rome and became head of the Church of England. Hence, the Roman Church was mother church of the Church of England. Okay, so I find it interesting. I want y'all to also make note of, just like the Catholic Church bows down to a woman, hence Mary. It's interesting that Henry made the Church of England the mother church. There is an esoteric reason for that. And once we get into some more sources, we'll talk about that. Spiritual and political importance of King James' anti-papal stance. James did more to thwart and repeal Jesuit and papal influence upon the Church of England than any other peer of his time, Stephen Costin. King James opposed Romanism on two fronts. First of all, Romanism was and is against the scriptures. The doctrine which is taught in the Church of God ought to be taken out of the Word of God. For controversies in matter of religion, let the scriptures be the judge. King James, this is coming out of a quote from the book Papal Opposition, page 34. King James considered himself a father to his subjects, and he cared about their spiritual health. Mm-hmm. Now, remember this. I want y'all to remember all this. Not wanting them to go to perdition, writing on their superstitions of Rome. It must be noted that King James was a soul winner. This can be seen in the king's own writings and those of his contemporaries who noted that he attempted to spread his religion throughout the realm. Second of all, King James opposed Romanism because it is anti-monarcher and pre-pope. Now, this just Rhonda. This was what it was really about. Okay? Because the Pope had too much power over his monarchy, he's like, you know what? So that's just my opinion, and I'll get into it a little bit more. During the Dark Ages, when Rome was in its monstrous glory, papists enforced to the bloodshed of multitudes subjections to the Pope, since their traditions state that the Pope has temporal and spiritual sovereignty over the whole world. Popes deposed kings, took lands, executed Bible believers, and encouraged reconsony, even in the time of King James, and took out kings. The most cursory look at history will find Rome at the center of lechery, whoredom, corruption, scandal, intrigues, and taking people out. King James, but out of all of this, and I'm not disagreeing with none of what they done said up in here, okay? But out of all of this, the Pope has temporal and spiritual sovereignty over the whole world. Okay? So as I stated in the beginning, this was really about the Pope, the Catholic Church, controlling the monarchs. So they made the decisions on which houses or which bloodlines were going to rule, and within those bloodlines who would seek powers, and even down to executing out the blueprint, the plans for colonizing the world and putting the entire world under the Pope's control, meaning the Pope had temporal and spiritual sovereignty over the whole world. Okay? That's what that was really about. Okay? But we're going to continue. We're going to continue. Because even when Henry VIII and King James, Henry VIII forming the Church of England, it was still a subsidiary of the Church of Rome, right? It was a subsidiary of the Church of Rome. So it still ultimately meant it rolled up to the Catholic Church. Now, that's just my opinion. And, that was the opinion of the cardinal dude that was telling King James to go ahead on with that bull mess. I don't care what church y'all done set up and created. You still roll up to Rome, which the Pope is the head of. Okay? So Henry VIII created England, Church of England, to say, look, just leave us alone, Pope. Just leave us alone. Now, we didn't set up this entity so we can go on and control our stuff now. Go on and leave us alone and let us do what we gonna do. Okay? But it didn't work like that. All right? But let's keep going. Because again, out of their own mouth, the Church of England was a Roman church. Okay, so hence it was a subsidiary of the Catholic Church. But let's continue. So we talked about the Pope having the spiritual sovereignty over the whole world. Popes depose king. Yeah. We talked about that and how they be doing their dirt. King James is often criticized for his belief in the divine right of kings, but the critics overlooked the importance of His Majesty's stand. With respect to the doctrine of the divine right of kings, this doctrine was the principal force restraining the authority of the popes in James' time and thereafter. Without the doctrine of the divine right, Roman Catholicism would have dominated history well beyond its current employment in the Dark Ages. Furthermore, divine right made it possible for the Protestant Reformation in England to take place, mature, and spread to the rest of the globe. Okay, so this is Stephen Costin's personal correspondence. Now, I say again, all religions still roll up to the Catholic Church. So all of this bucking that the kings them did, specifically King Henry VIII and King James, it just allowed subsidiaries of the Catholic Church. I'll say that again. Although Henry VIII and King James were opposing the Catholic Church, and Henry VIII set up the Church of England, he still set it up as a Roman church. So hence that makes it a subsidiary of the Catholic Church. So this protest, i.e. Protestant movement, was really just the ushering in to allow other branches of religions to exist. But make no mistake about it, behind the scenes, they ultimately are subsidiaries of the Catholic Roman Church, and they roll up to the Catholic Roman Church, and they still must perform things in a certain fashion. That's all religions. That's the hidden jewels, the hidden history. But if you do a little bit of research and you look into each organized religion, you look at their customs, i.e. their rituals, you look at their coats of arms, their symbols. Heck, even look down to the way that the preachers and the bishops now, and trying to think of the other name, any heads of those particular religious church, look at the way they dress. You'll see that it's all really the same thing. It's the same thing. But let's continue. James refused to accept or endorse any jurisdictional intrusion into the ancient vested authority of the crown in ecclesiastical matters. Okay? It was James' concerted opinion that the only authority of a king, backed by the universal support of fellow Protestant princes, could realistically challenge the usurped authority of the Pope. Okay, so again, to me, this is what this was all about. It was about the Catholic Church having jurisdiction or authority over a king's rulership. The Pope, the doctrine of the divine right of kings and their supremacy over any pope was near and dear to the heart of James, as the historical documents reveal. Furthermore, the well-known axiom of James, no bishop, no king, was similarly expressive of his attachment to royal direction over ministerial matters. Any perceived degradation of this dogma was strenuously opposed by James, right? So that was again from Stephen Costello's Papal Opposition. Did King James hate and persecute Catholics? Catholics opposed King James' accession to the English throne before he ever wrote one proclamation restricting them. He was a Protestant prince who was enough for assassination. In spite of their numerous errors, King James did not hate them. Even when the Catholic conspirators of the gunpowder plot were found, King James told his people in his speech to Parliament in 1605, for although it cannot be denied that it was the only blind superstition of their errors in religion that led them to this desperate device, yet does it not follow that all professing that Romanist religions were guilty of the same. In spite of their numerous intrigues, King James treated them amicably. How many did I honor with knighthood of known and open recusants? How indifferently did I give audience and access to both sides, bestowing equally all favors and honors on both professions? How free and continual access had all ranks and degrees of papists in my court and company? Okay, because I say you had to do that, King James. But, I'm just going to go on. Okay, let me just shut up and keep reading. And above all, how frankly and freely did I free rescants of their ordinary payments. Besides, it is evident what straight order was giving out of my own mouth to the judges to spare the execution of all priests, notwithstanding their convictions, joining thereto a gracious proclamation whereby all priests that were at liberty and not taken might go out of the country by such a day, but time and paper will fail me to make enumerations of all the benefits and favors that I bestow in general and in particular upon papists, in recounting whereof every scrap of my pen was served but for a blot of the Pope's ingratitude and injustice, in meeting with so hard a measure for same. So as I think I have sufficiently, or at least with good reason, wiped the tears from the Pope's eyes for complaining upon the persecution, who, if he had been but politically wise, although he had no respect to justice and the verity, would have this compliant of his, and for the main untruth of any persecution in my time, it can never be proved that any were or are put to death since I came to the crown for cause of conscience, except that now this discharge given by the Pope, let the blood light upon the Pope's head, who is the only cause thereof. So that was a quote from King James. So according to King James, look, I ain't tried to harm none of y'all. Matter of fact, I got y'all out of some of the payments y'all owed. I didn't put nobody to death unless, your sentence just straight up, you did it. It is what it is. You had to go. So I wasn't persecuting no Catholics, in other words. Mr. Costin notes, James walked a tight line. He had to be fair and show mercy to Roman Catholics on one hand, yet he had to keep them in check and punish the evil they did. Consequently, many Roman Catholics still revile his name to this day, and many would-be Protestants chastise him as being soft on Roman Catholics. Now, this right here, in my opinion, this is why I think he played both sides of the middle. Okay? Because I think this move for him denouncing Catholicism had everything to do with, of course, him having more power and say in his rulership as a king. So not having the papists rule over him as much. And it also gave him an opportunity to build a huge supporters that also oppose the Catholic Church and to establish their own faith. Okay, so in other words, to get the people behind him. Okay, so he, in my opinion, was still playing both sides of the fence. Okay, so apparently some of the Protestants felt that as well, felt you still let, you claim you're not cool with the Catholics, but you still letting them get away with a lot. So a lot of, it appears some Protestants saw through that. All right. But there is so much more. Papal opposition is such a meaty treat, overflowing with rich quotes from His Majesty King James that I am loath to end this review for inadequacy of treatment. But at last, all is not lost, gentle reader. You may order a copy. Yeah. So, he's pushing that. I'm going to get the little book. But based on what he showed, I already know what time it is because I pulled a little bit more stuff, of course. So again, this is from a blog done jesus-is-lord.com. And this was King James the First, a closeted Roman Catholic. And this is given a review done by King James, based off of a book, King James and Papal Opposition, by Stephen A. Costin. Okay. So now let's get into King James the First, King James Stewart the First. So let's just jump over to the Encyclopedia Britannica. So King James the First of England and Scotland. So King James, born 1566 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He died March 25th, 1625 in England. So he was King of Scotland as James VI from 1567 to 1625, and the first Stuart King of England from 1603 to 1625, who styled himself King of Great Britain. James was a strong advocate of royal absolutism, and his conflicts with an increasingly self-asserted Parliament set the stage for the rebellion against his successor, King Charles I. James was the only son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Okay, so remember his mom was a staunch Catholic, but we'll keep reading. 8 months after James' birth, his father died when his house was destroyed by an explosion. Child, that's mob style, honey. They stayed taking people out. After her third marriage to James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, Mary was defeated by rebel Scottish lords and abdicated the throne. James, 1 year old, became King of Scotland July 24th, 1567. Mary left the kingdom on May 16, 1568, and never saw her son again. I thought this was so sad. During his minority, James was surrounded by a small band of the great Scottish lords, from whom emerged the 4 successor regents, the Earls of Moray, Lennox, Mar, and Morton. Okay, and I hope y'all peeping some of these names. Okay, the names of places and folks took on surnames and all of that. So I hope y'all are peeping this stuff. Okay. There did not exist in Scotland the great gulf between rulers and rule that separated the Tudors and their subjects in England. For 9 generations, the Stuarts had in fact been nearly, sorry, let me read that again. For 9 generations, the Stuart had in fact been merely the ruling family among equals, and James, all his life, retained the feeling for those of great Scottish lords who gained his confidence. Okay, so wait a minute. I wanted to get to, this is what I wanted to show y'all. I just want to show y'all the Stuart family tree. Okay, so you can see 2 houses, the House of Alpine. Okay, so you can see the dynasties here. And so the Scottish royal dynasties, okay, all the way through 1625. All right, so you see it starts with Kenneth, and you see it's going all down in Constantine, Donald, Malcolm. Okay, you could just see all of this, how it's going down. I didn't even see this Macbeth up in here. Child, stop playing with me. All right, so just showing you the House of Alpin's side, okay, the Scottish side. Okay, and I also want y'all to pay attention to these names. Okay, so you should see where some of these surnames come to today. All right. Okay. So then there go William. Okay, I know folks know about King William. Okay, so William is a common surname in the U.S. And that's coming from King William. Okay, so any derivative of William is coming from this particular name or king. Okay, William's son is son of William, same derivative. Okay, y'all see the Alexandria up in there, or Alexander. Okay, that's the second, but there's the first up in there. Okay, so this remind me of Alexander the Great, going back to the Greeks and all of that jazz. All right, y'all see David up in here. That puts me in the mind of the Bible situation, a name up in the Bible. All right. So anyhow, so this is this particular side. All right. You see Robert, Bruce, and all of that. Okay. So this is the first side of this is the Scottish side of the Stuart dynasty. Okay. All right. So they are giving you this from 1842 to 1625. All right, so the next side is the House of Bruce. All right, and so you see this is starting with Robert. Okay. And which is Robert the Bruce. Then you see the House of Stuart here. Okay, y'all see Ross? Okay, this Ross name go back pretty far. All right. You remember when shout out again to Lee Cummings when he brought out that information linking the lineage of Harriet Tubman, who is a Ross, which is ultimately a Stuart. This is why. Okay. All right. So we go through here. You got Robert the Third. That's his particular branch. And then again, I want y'all to pay attention to the surnames. All right. You have Drummond, Fife, Albany. Are y'all getting this? Albany, New York, Buckhan or Buckyhan. Okay, Isles, Lord of the Isles. Hey, I'm sure that's Douglas over there. Douglas. All right. David Duke. So a KKK person. Remember the KKK person named David Duke? Oh, blood. So you took your name from a black ruling monarch? Child, they better go on somewhere with the foolishness. All right, so the first James name used on the Stuart side, in the Stuart dynasty you see here. Okay, but that was in 1400s. All right, and then there's the James II. Okay, and then you see where France came up into the heritage as well. Okay. Louis the 11th, if I'm not mistaken. All right. And you can see how they're marrying across different places. You have Austria in here. You have France. There's Geneva. All right. So then here's James III, who succeeded the second. Okay, and you can see he was linked up with Denmark. Okay, and remember when in one of the podcasts I was showing you the melanated people in Denmark that held the seat of power, and I'll put pictures again of those European monarchs as bonus material in this particular podcast as well. Okay. All right. So then you get down to James IV. Okay, so you see here go another James, Duke of Ross. Okay, so that Ross and that Stuart name go hand in hand. Okay, so this is why anytime, even today, when I personally see, and I noticed a gentleman in the comment section on one of the podcasts noted as well. I didn't know where he was going with it, but he pointed out, you mentioned that somebody was a Ross, and I can't even remember specifically what it was. Are they tied to the Stuarts? And I told him, I don't know for sure, but very well could have been. This was his reasoning for saying it, and that is very well taken, because anytime I see a person with the name of Ross and they are in politics, I automatically think, or of some sort of prominence, and they are melanated, I automatically think, are they tied to that Stuart bloodline? All right. So you can see in this case, here go Henry VIII linked up into the situation also. Okay, and then we get down to James V. Okay. And then we get down to the particular King James that we're talking about, which they're calling King James I. All right. So I just wanted to show you all that to give you an idea of the entire Stuart lineage with both houses, the House of Alpine and the House of Bruce. Okay. So let's get back. All right. So what did he say? Where was we at? Yeah. That was so sad that his mom didn't get to raise her baby. Okay, so during his minority, James was surrounded by a small band of great Scottish lords. Okay, so we talked about that. There did not exist in Scotland the great gulf between rulers and rule that separated the Tudors and their subjects in England. For 9 generations, the Stuarts had, in fact, been merely the ruling family among many equals, and James all his life retained a feeling for those of the great Scottish lords who gained his confidence. Okay, so I showed you in the family tree the Stuarts' Scottish rulership side. All right. The young king kept fairly isolated, but was given a good education until the age of 14. He studied Greek, French, and Latin and made good use of a library of classical and religious writings. That his tutors, George Buckingham and Peter Young, assembled for him. James's education aroused him in literary ambitions rarely found in princes, but which also tended to make him a pedant. Okay, and this is like the third time that I've read many other accounts of how read well King James the First was, that he was well read. Okay, so in other words, although a lot of these royals have access to all of this information, to have this great education, they be like, oh yeah, whatever, like most children, it just doesn't spark their interest. But he was different. Okay, and wow, what a great education he got. He got, access. He had access to the true information and the best information in the world. Okay? All right? So, before James was 12, he had taken the government nominally into his own hands when the Earl of Morton was driven from the regency in 1578. Now, how boss is that? But because he was so well read, he must have been a heck of a student. A heck of a student to be able to start coming into his own at the age of 12. For several years more, however, James remained the puppet of contending intriguers and faction leaders after falling under the influence of the Duke of Lennox, a Roman Catholic who schemed to win back Scotland for the imprisoned Queen Mary. James was kidnapped by William Ruthven, 1st Earl of Gowrie, in 1583 and was forced to denounce Lennox. The following year, James escaped from his Protestant captors and began to pursue his own policies as king. All right, so y'all get this shenanigans that was going on. All right, so he was a young boy. Okay, and the power struggle between the Catholic Church and the monarch it goes all the way to back then. All right. So even the Protestants or the protesters had kidnapped him as a child. Okay, but let's keep going. His chief purposes were to escape from subservience to Scottish factions and to establish his claim to succeed the childless Elizabeth I upon the throne of England. Realizing the more was to be gained by cultivating Elizabeth's goodwill than by allying himself with her enemies. James, in 1586 to 86, concluded an alliance with England. Thenceforward, in his own unsteady fashion, he remained true to this policy, and even Elizabeth's execution of his mother in 1587 drew from him only formal protest. Okay, so now this is just according to them that he was being strategic. He like, you know what? I'm going to go this route and aligned with the English side and not aligned with the Scottish side. Okay. All right. In 1589, James was married to Anne, the daughter of Frederick II of Denmark. Okay. And we showed a picture of Frederick II. I think we showed a picture of Anne too. In that bonus material. Both melanated. And I'll put that bonus material in this podcast as well at the end of the podcast. Who in 1594 gave birth to their first son, Prince Henry. James's rule of Scotland was basically successful. He was able to play off Protestant and Roman Catholic factions of Scottish nobles against each other. And through a group of commissioners known as the Octavians, 1596 to 97, he was able to rule Scotland almost as absolutely as Elizabeth I ruled England. So I think that's what it was all about. He was moving strategically. It wasn't about religion for him. He was moving strategically to rule both kingdoms, the Scotland kingdom as well as England. The king was a convinced Presbyterian, but in 1584 he secured a series of acts that made him the head of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, with the power to appoint the church's bishops. So again, this was a power move. When James at length succeeded to the English throne on the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, he was already, as he told the English Parliament, an old and experienced king and one with a clearly defined theory of royal government. Unfortunately, neither his experience nor his theory equipped him to solve the new problems facing him, and he lacked the qualities of mind and character to supply the deficiencies. James hardly understood the rights or temper of the English Parliament, and he thus came into conflict with it. He had little contact with the English middle classes, and he suffered from the narrowness of his horizons. His 22-year-long reign over England was to prove almost as unfortunate for the Stuart dynasty as his years before 1603 had been fortunate. Okay, so even with them trying to lighten him up, you could see up under there that curly melanated hair. Oh. There was admittedly much that was sensible in his policies, and the opening years of his reign as king of Great Britain were a time of material prosperity for both England and Scotland. For one thing, he established peace by speedily ending England's war with Spain in 1604, but the true test of his statesmanship lay in the handling of Parliament, which was claiming ever wider rights to criticize and shape public policy. Moreover, Parliament's established monopoly of granting taxes made its assent necessary for improvements of the Crown's finances, which had been seriously undermined by the expense of the long war with Spain. James, who had so successfully divided and corrupted Scottish assemblies, never mastered the subtler art of managing an English parliament. He kept a few privy councillors in the House of Commons and thus allowed independent members there to seize the initiative. Moreover, his lavish creations of new peers and later in his reign, his subservience to various recently ennobled favorites loosened his hold upon the House of Lords. His fondness for lecturing both houses of parliament about his royal prerogatives offended them and drew forth such counterclaims as the Apology of the Commons, 1604. Two parliamentary statesmen used to Tudor dignity, James Shambling Gait, restless garrulity, and dribbling mouth ill befitted his exhausted claims to power and privilege. When Parliament refused to grant him a special fund to pay for his extravagances, James placed new customs duties on merchants without Parliament's consent, thereby threatening its control of governmental finances. Moreover, by getting the law courts to proclaim these actions as law, 1608, after Parliament had refused to enact them, James struck at the House legislative supremacy. In 4 years of peace, James practically doubled the debt left by Elizabeth, and it was hardly surprising that when his chief minister, Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, tried in 1610-11 to exchange the king's feudal revenues for a fixed annual sum from Parliament, the negotiations over this so-called great contract came to nothing. James dissolved Parliament in 1611. Baby, they was going back and forth. All right, so the abortive great contract and the death of Cecil in 1612 marked the turning point of James' reign. He was never to have another chief minister who was so experienced and so powerful. During the ensuing 10 years, the king summoned only the brief addled Parliament of 1614. Deprived of parliamentary grants, the crown was forced to adopt unpopular expedients such as the sale of monopolies to raise funds. Child, what they sell? You know, they done stole everything anyway, but okay. Oh, they didn't list what they sold. Moreover, during these years, the king succumbed to the influence of the incompetent Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset. Carr was succeeded as the king's favorite by George Villiers, first Duke of Buckingham, who showed more ability as chief minister, but was even more hated for his arrogance as his monopoly of royal favor. In his later years, the king's judgment faltered. He embarked on a foreign policy that fused discontent into formidable opposition. The king felt a sympathy which his countrymen found inexplicable for the Spanish ambassador Diego Sarmiento, Count of Gondomar. When Sir Walter Raleigh, who had gone to Guiana in search of gold, came into conflict with the Spaniards, who were then at peace with England, Gondomar persuaded James to have Raleigh beheaded. Woo, baby! Child, clutching my pearls. Now, Raleigh and I don't know, I can't get up in their business because, child, I wasn't there. But, you know, Raleigh was also sent over to do the first, one of the first colonies. And that business venture did not go well at all. So I'm wondering if that was just one more layer in the complexity. Like, okay, so you over there not getting along with my boy. Plus you didn't set up on your tail and you didn't make this colony over in the New World. You financially messed that up. You know what? Get them out of here. So I'm just throwing that into the mix as well. Child. With Gondomar's encouragement, James developed a plan to marry his second son and heir, Charles, to a Spanish princess, along with a concurrent plan to join with Spain in mediating the 30-year war in Germany. The plan, though plausible in the abstract, showed an astonishing disregard for English public opinion, which solidly supported James' son-in-law Frederick, the Protestant elector of the Palatinate, whose land were then occupied by Spain. Child, this stuff was a hot mess, baby. When James called a third parliament in 1621 to raise funds for his designs, that body was bitterly criticized of his attempts to ally England with Spain. James, in a fury, tore the record of the offending Protestants from the House of Commons Journal and dissolved the parliament. Child. So again, I'm just reading through this to show y'all this was not about no religion. This was all about power moves. Okay? So just based on what we're reading here, I can see why some Protestants that remember all this information would say that in their opinion, King James was really a Catholic. Okay? To me, he was neither, and I'll get to the last journey of that in just a little bit. We gonna jump to that in a little bit. All right. So the Duke of Buckingham had begun in enmity with Prince Charles, who became their heir when his brother Prince Harry died in 1612. But in the course of time, the two formed an alliance from which the king was quite excluded. James was now aging rapidly, and in the last 18 months of his reign, he in effect exercised no power. Charles and Buckingham decided most issues. James died at his favorite country residency. Okay, besides the political problems that he bequeathed to his son, Charles, James left a body of writings which, though of mediocre quality as literature, entitle him to a unique place among English kings since the time of Alfred. Chief among those writings are two political treatises, the True Law of Free Monarchs, 1598, and Boscawen-Doran, 1599, in which he expounded his own views on the divine rights of kings. Now that should be interesting. I'm going to take a look at those and see what shakes out with those. The 1660 edition of the Political Works of James was edited by Charles Howard McLean in 1918. The Poems of James of Scotland, the second volume, was edited by James Craig in 1955 to 1958. In addition, James famously oversaw a new authorized English translation of the Bible, published in 1611, which became known as the King James Version. Okay, so we do know that, all right? But what is not talked about, what he commissioned. Okay, so we know he commissioned the Bible. He also commissioned something called demonology. Yeah, I know, Christians. You don't ever want to talk about that King James Stewart, King James the First Stewart, commissioned a work called Demonology. Yeah, you want to leave that out, okay? And see, this is why my opinion was King James was not about religion at all. So that whole thing about him being Catholic versus Protestant, nah, that was a power move, okay? Let's just get into a high level, and I'll make reference in this particular podcast because we did an entire series on demonology. We literally read through that entire body of work. But here, just at a high level, we'll just talk about it. In 1597, King James of Scotland, King James VI of Scotland, published a compendium on witchcraft, lore called demonology. So now, why would a starch Christian publish a work on witchcraft? It was also published in England in 1603 when James acceded to the English throne. The book asserts James's full belief in magic and witchcraft and aims to both prove the existence of such forces and to lay down what sort of trial and punishment these practices merit. In James's view, death. Okay? So the whole book of demonology is an argument between whether or not the myths of the supernatural and with witchcraft are not only true, but it also goes into how those practicing it should be persecuted and put to death. Okay? All right? So it could have very well been giving insight into how they were persecuting what they were calling witches back in the day. But even in that work of demonology, they are telling you that the people that were practicing witchcraft were the indigenous people of the particular land. That King James and them were going around stealing and taking and hence instituting colonies. And it also in that work talks about how they were very frightened of the witches, i.e. the women. Okay. So it's very, very interesting. So again, in my opinion, King James really wasn't about religion from a Catholic perspective or a Protestant perspective. I do believe, based on his education and based on the access of information that he had at his hands, that he absolutely was able to get a hold to the esoteric knowledge. And he was more on that side of the house and used a combination of that as well as some of the other great generals that moved strategically. Okay? So in my opinion, King James was not religious at all. He was not Catholic or Protestant at all. He didn't hold allegiance to either. That was just a strategy for rulership. Okay? All right, so let me see. Let me see. Did we talk about that? Yeah, we did. It says demonology in Macbeth. Many elements of the witchcraft scenes in Macbeth conform to James's idea and belief in witchcraft as expressed in demonology. News from Scotland and his anti-witchcraft legislation. This includes ideas such as the witches vanishing / invisible flight, their raising of storms. Yeah, definitely talked about that. Dancing and chanting, sexual acts, their gruesome, potent ingredients, and the presence of animals' familiarities. Oh, all right. Okay, so Scholars are divided as to whether Shakespeare's portrayal of witchcraft panders to the king's interest, or whether it is more subversion comment on his involvement with witch hunting, or perhaps a mixture of the two. It seems noteworthy that although the play Macbeth is contaminated with the witchcraft of the wayward sisters, and Macbeth himself is spurred on by their prophecies and the urging of his somewhat witchy wife, Shakespeare places the responsibility for Duncan's taking out on Macbeth himself, and Macbeth's downfall is a result of his tyranny as king. His greatest error in his dealings with the witches seemed to be his cruelty and being naive with their double-speaking prophecy. So that's interesting. I'm not a Shakespeare fan, but I do know the demonology stuff now just by the reading of this, but I would have never tied Macbeth tying into demonology. That's interesting. Okay, so it says the bindings, books of this period were usually sold unbound for customers to commission their own bindings according to the tale. Oh, yeah. I'm not going to go through that. Okay, so I just wanted to remind people, because that's always left out of the equation. When we talk about King James and the Protestants and the whole Catholicism stuff, and everybody gives him credit for commissioning for the Bible to be, quote, quote, rewritten or put together as one book versus just a collection. He gets the credit for all of that. He's known as being a Protestant and being strictly against Catholicism, but yet he also commissioned for demonology, which was all about witchcraft. And the book was literally about an argument about whether or not witchcraft is true. Okay? And as we've gone through a couple of sources, it appears that King James wasn't about him being a Catholic. It wasn't about him being a Protestant. It was all about him maneuvering, playing both sides to rule both kingdoms, Scotland and England, and then as well as to get a lot more power and not be under the control of the Catholic Church. Okay? So, in my opinion, King James was not a Catholic. He was not a Protestant. I think he used religion as just an opportunity or a chess piece for rulership. I think that he was well-read, well-versed. I think he studied all religions. I think he studied a lot of the esoteric. And more than likely, he was probably non-religion. Okay? And if he did have some sort of religion, it would be more on the esoteric side. All right? So now that's just my opinion, of course. I'm far from knowing what the truth really, really was. I wasn't there. I can only read through these accounts. So that's just my 2 cents. That's what I'm rolling with. But interestingly, it's interesting nonetheless. And again, it once makes me question the official narrative that they give us regarding King James and the whole being a staunch Protestant, this, that, and the third. So I hope that you all got something out of this. And shout out to the brother God of Green for sending me that question. I truly, truly appreciate it. Thank you all, family, for your support. And if you are not subscribed to us, I highly encourage you to subscribe, like, and share. This is Rhonda with WTUZ Radio Podcast. I wish everyone well on this Saturday night. Peace and love, family.